We'll start. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We welcome you all to today's webinar on leadership and board involvement in sustainability, hosted by Nishpin Consulting. Those of you who don't know me, I am the CEO of Nishpin and also founder of a new startup called CopStage, which is a sustainability platform. I'm heading Asia as a regional ambassador for Women Entrepreneurship Days organization. And lately we entered into strategic partnership with Gold Ventures Investment for Asia. Now, for the past 15 years, I've been working in the field of corporate governance and sustainability consulting and training. And today we are honored and grateful to have Ms. Hele Bank Jorgensen and Mr. Nicholas Banish as our special guests today, who have been working with the boards and in the area of corporate governance for decades. They both have made strides in ensuring that leadership, governance, and sustainability are prioritized in the organizations and have taken steps to ensure that corporations don't lose sight of the importance of these through educating and guiding them through the process. Hele Bank is the CEO and founder of Competent Boards, which offers the global online ESG Competent Board Certificate and Designation Program with the faculty of over 100 renowned international board members, executives, and experts. She has a 30-year track record in turning environmental, social governance, climate, and sustainability risks into innovative and profitable business opportunities. She has worked with many global Fortune 500 board members and executives, as well as smaller companies and investors. Lately, she has collaborated with SAT Business School and University of Oxford, Thunderbird, Arizona State Universities, and Pennyboard to offer the Climate Competent Boards Certificate Program. She's also been the board member of World Economic Forum Expert Network for Corporate Governance, Leadership, and Emerging Multinationals, His Royal Highness Prince of Wales Global Expert Panel, Non-Financial Digitization Working Group of Impact Management Project, Reuters Panel, and again, many more. Hele was the creator of the world's first green account based on life cycle assessment and the world's first integrated report, the first integrated responsible supply chain management system, and the principal organizer for the CEO Network for Business Ethics and Non-Financial Reporting. She led the improvement of investor communication for global companies and has worked on national capital accounting for IFC and World Bank. Nicholas Banish is the founder of Board Director Training Institute of Japan. Nicholas has a background in both law and business, and he was a proposer of Japan's governance code, and I'm a big fan of that. And he played a key role of proposing other general topics such as executive compensation, ESG, dual class share structures, etc. He recently proposed redesigning of incentives in corporations by creating an externalization bankruptcy trust or ESG dividend fund, which I'm intrigued to learn more about it from him today. This proposal has been published and is available at the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance blog. He was twice elected governor of the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan and was longtime chair of its FDI committee and presently chairs the Growth Strategy Task Force. In the past, he has served as a member of the Experts Committee of Japan Investment Council and Advisory Committee of the Japanese Cabinet on FDI policy. Mr. Banish has served as a director of various Japanese corporations, and he also served as a member of Financial Service Agency Corporate Governance Liaison Committee, which had been formed to provide private sector input to the Ministry of Justice and Legal Affairs Advisory Council regarding amendment of Japanese company law. If you would like more information about the speakers and biography, you can contact us through email. Now, let me take a few minutes to introduce the topic to you. The topic of today is leadership and board involvement in sustainability. We know that the world is becoming warmer, deadlier, and poorer. I'm not scaring you all, but that's the reality. When we are left with only a fixed budget of carbon dioxide to that also we have only 50% chance to evenly consume that much level. Yeah, so how do we overcome that? How do we overcome these issues? Now, the world leaders have adopted 17 global goals to attain peace and prosperity by 2030. And we are seeing on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, new regulations are coming out from different countries. For example, Europe is the leader there, NFRD, SFDR, CSRD, and EU taxonomies are the prime examples. SEC is also coming up with new regulations very soon. Consumers, they are also aware and they're protesting everywhere. Nobody wants greenwashing, especially when they're buying goods and looking at the labels behind the products and so on. So even consumers are putting pressures on the company. Overall, the combination of pressure from below in the form of consumer action, citizen protests, and pressure from above in the form of government action and investor pressure means that companies have come under increasing pressure. Markets need high quality comparable information from companies to enable the capital allocation decisions in the form of climate exchange risks. So here the companies are, they exist for profitability. They want to, because of the protests, they have to engage with their customers. They are looking for more employee satisfaction. They have to comply, they have to achieve the compliance. But how to commit and comply and achieve the sustainable goals? Now, there are other pressures. For example, net zero alliances. All the companies are entering into net zero alliances, and the companies are thinking how to commit to these goals, whether these are achievable, and UN SDGs, then various reporting frameworks, which they are thinking of which one to adopt and which one to use. And here the investors they are saying, oh, whatever you are doing, we don't believe this is greenwashing, blue washing, value washing, and even the customers are putting pressure. So today we have our esteemed speakers with us who will share with us what they think and how can leadership play a role in achieving these goals for the companies. Before we start, I want to take a quick poll from you and understand what's your opinion about the pressing challenge of today. So we keep hearing about 3 challenges. Please let me know if you can see my screen. Yeah, considering the Sustainable Development Goal challenges, which is the most pressing challenge of today? 100% of the people are saying climate change. So, Banish-san, what do you think? Which one is the most pressing challenge?
I guess I would agree, definitely climate change, which leads to biodiversity loss and it's connected to water scarcity. But as you said, we have I like your wording, we have a limited budget of oxygen, basically, or carbon that we can burn up before we go over the tipping point. So I'm very concerned about this. We're talking about saving the world or saving civilization in the next 50 years.
Yeah. So I heard about climate change and biodiversity. Which one, Hele, do you think are these two?
Well, I think you said it very well. I mean, you have climate change issues at the moment. The next big is the biodiversity, but climate change is leading also to the biodiversity. Clearly, water is a huge issue. I mean, we can't exist without water, right? We might be able to exist when it gets a little bit warmer, not a lot of warmer, but if we don't have the water. So I think all of those 3 are so interrelated. And yes, you're right. We have the carbon budget. The problem is that we're using too much. So even though if we say we go net zero right today, we'll still actually need to get minus that because of the carbon we already put out. So we need to have drawdown. We need to have a lot of other things in place. And of course, as you're saying, biodiversity. That's another thing. We can't survive if we don't have food, and we are taking some of this biodiversity for granted at the moment. So yeah,
absolutely, because each of them actually affect each other. And then, yeah, it's very difficult. So we have to make a balance. We have to focus on everything. However, yes, given the limited budget, the carbon is the priority, the first one. Now, I would request our speakers to talk about their organizations, because I understand that both of you are doing directors training. So I would like to learn from you what you do in the training part, and then we'll go to the next section, so the question and answer format. Okay, so I'll start with Banish-san, and would like to know about Board of Directors Training Institute in Japan.
Well, what the Board Director Training Institute Japan is a very special kind of nonprofit you can create, and it can be certified by the government and thereafter inspected as one that serves the public interest. That's called a public interest nonprofit. And I was able, after being rejected 3 or 4 times, to convince the Japanese government to acknowledge the fact that governance training and director training in particular is something that serves the public interest. It's good for society. Prior to our designation or certification, the government had never, ever once said anything, whatever, about training, about governance or directors, positive or negative, nothing. They didn't acknowledge it existed. So that's one of the purposes, was to get that acknowledgement. And what we do is offer, because this kind of nonprofit has the ability to receive tax deductible or tax credited donations. We receive donations, interestingly, 99% of which are not from Japanese institutions, but are from a large group of various active fund managers, mainly, or activists, and some small number of passive type people, but foreign investors almost entirely. And that is used to subsidize director training in all sorts of courses that we offer, and the creation of e-learning for fundamental knowledge about corporate law, securities law, governance policy, or governance theory, and governance code, and that sort of thing. And I give a lot of speeches and do a lot of missionary work for free, basically, as part of this role. We also create data using AI and algorithms. We have some very proficient Indian programmers who understand AI well and use that to machine read the actual quite large volume of publicly available data from financial reports or corporate governance reports given to the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and so forth, or voting reports, this sort of thing. And a large amount of that, we talk about big data nowadays, but a large amount of that data, people don't realize, is not being read by machines, and is not being enabled to be efficiently analyzed and compared between companies, and compared to what they were disclosing 3 years ago by machines. And the world of the future is this has to be all done automatically and quickly and efficiently by machines, not by human beings, which is very slow and subject to subjective judgment. So I'm very keen, as part of our role, also to furnish data that's not available by FactSet or Bloomberg or Refinitiv right now, that we can gain by programming these algorithms to extract certain bits of data that are very useful. For instance, Allegiant shareholdings or cross shareholdings by companies, this kind of stuff, for assessing their degree of quality of governance or ESG. We mainly focus on governance right now because that is Japan's sort of weak point, in my view. And I got into this, I'll just, maybe I should make this short, but my background is as an investment banker at JP Morgan for many years, and then having my own boutique M&A advisory firm. Along the way, I started to sit on boards, and the first board I sat on for 4 or 5 years went bankrupt. So I'm very familiar with this issue of sustainability in a sort of scar tissue context. And it is lack of good governance and lack of good leadership by boards, which largely is a factor when a company goes bankrupt, which is, obviously the worst kind of sustainability you can have. So I get into this on the Japanese end by we need to increase productivity and growth here through better governance. but we also need to decrease externalized risk in the environment and effect on climate change and that thing at the same time, or my grandchildren won't have a world to live in, is what I'm concerned about. So that's what I'm working on. At a loss to myself over the last 11 years of a lot of money, but I'm happier for the money I've lost.
Okay. Thank you so much. Amazing work. May I ask Helly now to talk about competent boards?
Indeed, and thank you very much for this. And I think thank you also for all your impact for both of you. So competent boards, we launched that actually in Davos, so during the World Economic Forum in 2019, so not that long ago. And the reason for launching competent boards and putting ESG and climate and diversity and cybersecurity and human rights, etc., on the agenda for boards was because I've worked, you said it, you see my gray hair, 30 years in this area, and I've seen a lot of companies, frankly, putting projects when it comes to social projects or environmental projects, but not having the governance, and therefore it was projects that, let's just face it, was a little bit a pet project for some. A new CEO came in, and then it was caught. So I worked with Paul Pullman, who at that point was the CEO of Unilever, and the chair of Unilever, Michael Tresco, at that point, and asked questions, what's going to happen when there's a new CEO, and long story short, I had those fantastic leaders, but also a lot of other leaders, where I said, where do you get your insight when it comes to environmental, social, sustainability, climate change issues? And there wasn't really anything in the programs. So in the same way as you were saying, rejected a few places where I went out and saying, we need to have this embedded in traditional director training, but there wasn't really a appetite, let's just call it that. So I decided, okay, well, we need to start this up. So we started competent boards as an online, because I wanted to ensure that we had stewardship, not only stewardship within the borders, but we actually had the diversity of thought, the diversity of all these different countries. So we have people joining us from Australia, even though it's late. We have people joining us from Hawaii in the middle of the night. We have people joining us from all continents, as I normally say, apart from Antarctica, and I think that's a good thing. So we have people from all over the world joining both the ESG Competent Board Certificate and Designation Program, and taking them through 12 different topics that are so essential now at the board agenda. Now I see that Financial Times Agenda is saying that boards are looking for people with ESG competences. That was not the case a few years ago. So we really have to up the training of the existing. Of course, also, I believe we need to see new directors entering into the boardrooms with perhaps fresh perspectives. And I believe that we have, as board of directors, we are stewards. Yes, we're stewards of the financials, but we're frankly also stewards of the water you talked about before. We're stewards of the land. We're stewards of all of those things that we as a company, have the ability to either impact good or ill. And I believe that is some of the things that I'm hearing, that people that are going through the program, they see they get the foresight, they get the insight, but also, frankly, the confidence to have these discussions, and for some, the courage to say what is the right thing. And clearly now, where investors are asking for it, when courtrooms are asking for it, when young people that you were showing before are asking for it, talent is asking for it, customers asking for it, it's much easier. But at the same time, it's harder, because all of those fantastic board of directors that's out there never been trained in this. suddenly need to get to the next step. And that's also why we, in terms of climate, we see at the moment, as you say, climate change, and at the top of the, we see a lot of board of directors being asked to commit to targets. We want to be net zero by, and then put a, and often it is because the competitors have said we want to be. And I want to make sure that those board of directors, the executives, not only commit, but actually also ensure that they fully understand and also get the advantages, get the opportunities. But you need to have the plan, you need to have the budget in place for it, you need to have the accountability, you need to have the governance. And what I'm seeing now is that the investors, all of these stakeholders we talked about before, they're starting to demand that the board of directors not only not to the different targets, etc., but actually can go out and talk about it and have that dialogue with the investors, have that dialogue with the employees. And to do that and be confident in that, I believe we need to have people trained. So we put this Climate Competent Board certificate program together with Oxford, University of Oxford, Said Business School, with Arizona State University, the GFL Institute, and with Thunderbird Global School of Management, fantastic to see the interest from global leaders and board of directors and executives and people all around the world in getting to that, understanding what this is about, and actually be part of the solution. So I can share some links.
Yes, please. Yes, I totally agree that it's actually a mindset also shift from shareholder interest that they used to take care earlier, according to agency theory, as you rightly said, that they had to move towards stewardship, and now the stakeholder. So stakeholder capitalism has become a big thing, and that's what even I'm promoting. Actually, I keep talking about stakeholder capitalism. Yeah, so we are going to do this discussion in various areas. So the first area is importance of good governance for achieving sustainability. So my first question will be to Banesh-san. In one of your interviews, you mentioned that many companies appear to think that having good E&S can excuse poor financial performance and substandard governance. On the other hand, you have said that without good governance on the board level that thinks deeply about sustainability, disclosure about environmental and sustainability factors ends up just as PR or IR, greenwashing, and not much else. So my question to you is, why does corporate governance come first than E and S? And what's your take on stakeholder capitalism and sustainability?
Well, I guess I have to first admit that maybe up front, I'm not a stakeholder capitalism person, because after 35 plus years in Japan, the word stakeholder capitalism here means something different to folks here than it did 5 years ago than it may elsewhere in the world. My point of view is, maybe this is because I'm a lawyer or I'm an investment banker or this type of background, but that really what we need is very, very, very long-term shareholder based capitalism that of course thinks of stakeholder needs, because anybody who's ever managed a company knows you need a lot of these stakeholders. You need the support of the public and your employees and this kind of thing. And that goes without saying. If you are of a very long-term mindset, you will not be sustainable as a company without that. So that's kind of my perspective. So you ask, well, why is G so important? Well, again, I see these things, Japanese spectacles, and I apologize for that, but Japanese companies pride themselves on being very long-term in mindset. And by that token are kind of proud of, and rightfully so, of having a lot of long-lived companies here that have been sustainable And that we have, they think they have a sustainability sort of mindset that may be ahead of some other countries. On the other hand, that long-term mindset is not really driven by global sustainability so much as it is by the desire to keep people employed at the company 10, 15, 20 years from now, not have to ever fire someone. So it's not really driven by the things that you and I are often thinking about in our minds. But most importantly, ESG won't work, in my view, medium or long term. It simply will not work if boards are not in charge of the topic of sustainability from the ground up. In other words, doing scenario planning long term, very seriously as to those ESG factors, particularly climate related, which will affect us and exactly how they will affect us and what will we even mitigate those things. All of those, remaining sustainable over the next 20, 30, 40 years of what's going to be increasingly rapid technological change, climate change, et cetera, social change. This requires very detailed, long, hard thinking and scenario planning, and things that are very difficult to decide that are connected to your long-term strategy. And those are things that the board has to be accountable for. If the board doesn't lead those things, they won't happen in the right way in the long term. And the other reason so in a sense, G at the board level is the driver of the bus of ESG. You have this bus, it's ESG. It's gonna go from A to Z and onwards onto success. It's not gonna go there without a driver. That's the board. Anything else that is done is exactly as Hella said, a project, which has a limited life, and a certain tantosha, a person in charge of it, who will then go on to some other job, and it won't live on for very long. The other reason I'm very much the G sort of driver of the bus in mindset is that Japanese companies here have a way of talking about ESG as a reason to not have to talk very much about improving their governance. We talk about all the good, nice things you've done here, or planting trees there, or decreasing water, or goals for net zero, et cetera, et cetera. But the things that will long-term have the most impact on that are improving governance, where Japan is relatively weaker than certain countries, not every country. And anyway, could, given a sincere approach here and the intelligence of people here, improve a lot. And so that being the weak point, it's the thing that needs to be improved the most, and I tend to focus on it. Whereas a lot of Japanese companies sort of don't want to talk about G very much. That requires a lot of difficult change in social organizations that they don't like to change. The status quo is more comfortable, and I can retire early in 5 years. Yeah, that's why G is central. And I think probably Hella is on exactly the same wavelength. This is obvious to anyone who's been on a board, I believe.
Yeah. So, I wanted to ask you about the ESG in Japan. And as you rightly said, that Japan is, I think, better in terms of E and S overall as a society, but G is weaker there, right? And
I think E is true, but S, there are a lot of areas in which S is not so high, where we can improve a lot. And the treatment of women is one.
yes,
And treatment of
agree.
temporary labor staff, et cetera, and labor flexibility, that kind of thing, or paternity leave, and there's a whole slew of issues. Training is one. The level of training is very low here compared to other developed nations.
Yeah.
So we have a lot to work on in S too. That's right.
Yes, I agree. Yes. So some of the indicators of S are good, but then some are very weak. Yes, yes. Right. So Heli, my next question is to you about, normally courts have prescribed all over the world, and you do the training, and you know that there are mainly 3 committees on the board: nominations, remunerations, and audit committee. So nowadays, the boards are talking about sustainability committee. Now, what are your views on that committee? Does it really help? And what is your take on that?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and the really bad answer, it depends, right? But let me just start with actually a survey that was made out of a fantastic organization that I advise in Singapore in terms of sustainability board, that went in and did a survey of the largest companies in the world and how many both women, when you talked about women, it serves at the board, but also how many of those companies had a committee overseeing ESG, sustainability, climate change, call it what you want, right? But overseeing that aspect. And that was going up. They went to look at how many directors was serving in those committees. That was going up. They looked at how many of those committee members had competences that they could read if they looked at the reports, they looked at their LinkedIn, they looked at other things. How could they see if these people actually had the insight to provide real oversight? That went up. But when I started looking at the numbers and being also an accountant and a business lawyer, but the accountant that I probably looked at here was to say, well, it might be that all the numbers went up, but when I started comparing the numbers, it turned out that there was 17% of those directors serving on a committee overseeing sustainability, ESG, etc., that on the paper had the competences. And I asked the question, would we be happy if we had 17% of those directors serving on an audit committee able to read a P&L, income statement, balance sheet? And I guess the answer would be probably not. The investors would probably say, okay, let's make sure we have we really understand these. So for me, it's not so much do you have a committee. Mm-hmm. For me is, do you have the competences? Do you have the insight to provide that foresight that we need to help the management team, and of course the oversight to ensure that we are going the right direction? And that can be that we put, we have that in the audit committee, we have it in Gov, we have it, in all the different committees. This is the responsibility, of course, of the board, and how that board wants to organize that can be in many different ways. It could be that you say you have a committee, new committee, that have the chair of all of those other three committees. So in that way, you start, really ensuring that is embedded, because clearly when you go to the audit committee, you want to make sure that those that have there also looking not only at the financials, but also looking at the, sustainability measures that's more and more embedded in the financials. You want to make sure that they ask their auditors, have you looked to see if we have stranded assets? Have you looked to see all of these different things? If you come to in terms of remuneration, you want to start asking, what are our incentives? Are we really putting the incentives in place that will drive what we hope to see? Or are we actually having incentives that have the opposite effect that unfortunately I see many places? And of course it comes into NumGov, right? I mean, who are we actually nominating to, and how is our governance function? So this is not, in my mind, something we say, okay, we put that in that committee, and then it's a silo. It's part of the way of driving the business, and that's also what I'm been saying, that one thing is we talk so much about a company needs to have a purpose. Yes, and most companies do have, and if we go back and see where that purpose started, it was often to serve society. That might have changed over time, but I think the board as a whole need to ask the question, what's our purpose? Our purpose, and we're talking about shareholder versus stakeholder primacy. You can say that, I mean, in my mind, it's to the company. And it's to, I'm going back to being the stewards, leaving that company and all the things that that company is touching, perhaps in a better way than you found it, right? It's not an easy job. It's not an easy job. So I'm not giving you a concrete answer saying, okay, yeah, put a committee in place and tick that box, because it's not that easy. You need to really ensure that you embed and you understand the organization, you understand where that organization will be going, where you want it to go, and how do you as the board have that oversight. And nowadays, it's not just because it's the right thing to do, it's because you actually have the investors asking for it, and you have the courtrooms asking for it, as well as, of course, your stakeholders.
So, we say that sustainability is an integrated strategy. And looking at all the capitals, I think you were the first one to propose for the integrated report. And then, yes, so you nailed it very well. My next question was actually from the second discussion area, which is effective board oversight. And I think you answered the first question from that section, that how to achieve an effective board oversight and how should leaders and board ask the right questions about sustainability. So I think you answered that. Now, my next question is, how could leaders prioritize ESG issues? That's to you, Hele.
How can leaders prioritize? I think they are. And I think if they're not, they are forced to it, right? I mean, you showed the pictures. And I think if you don't prioritize, it's going to come back and bite you. Right? It's kind of like the same as when we talked about climate change. It's pay now or pay later. But I just put an article out in Greenpeace, which is a global outlet in terms of that. I can share that as well in terms of the IPCC report. That's this governmental report about the state of the climate, basically. And one of the things that I said was that, well, if you talk about going to the bank right now, most countries, if you go to the bank, you can get money for very, very little interest rate. Mm-hmm. But if you go to the carbon bank mm-hmm. and you deduct more than we can, that interest rate is skyrocketing. And we are going to pay it one way or another. If that is we put a tax in, if that is that, as we're seeing all over the world right now, that we're having, catastrophic, being that flooding, being that drought, being that other weather events, we are paying at the moment. So I think it's a question about, pay now or pay later. And if you pay later, it's going to be very, very, very costly. And that's where I think you need as leaders, we need as leaders, it's all of us to ask, how can we use what we already have available right now? We already have it. It's just starting to using it. And either we do it or we're going to be forced to do it.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much for that answer. Over to you, Banish-san, and then you can add on to this and also answer my next question on how to achieve better board engagement and shareholders with ESG issues.
Okay, I think this is a fascinating discussion. The ESG as a concept has been there for a while. What's fascinating about Japan is that, I used to talk about ESG in our director training courses in 2013. Nobody knew what the letters stood for. I still have to explain that to make sure that everyone understands what do these letters stand for. And basically, my point is that this is a truck which is coming at you and has been coming at you for years now. That's my purpose of that 5-minute section, is this to wake people up to that. But that's actually proceeded quite quickly in the last year or so. The question has been raised, should directors be certified in some way for ESG competency? And so there's all a discussion about competency now. I think it's excellent. As a, Director Training Institute CEO, my point of view is directors need to be certified as directors, period, around the world. Not just about ESG competency, but about all the competencies that directors have to have. It is, to me, appalling, absurd that we allow people, just because they have famous names or good resumes or where they were good bag carriers, so they got promoted nicely up the ladder, to be on 6 or 7 boards at the same time, ridiculously overboarded, without necessarily the right skills for that company, or without understanding law and how to even read accounting statements some of the time, et cetera, as was mentioned by Hella. And we don't question that at all. Even though these people haven't passed a test or proven their skills or shown their ability or their dedication, you would not get on an airline if the pilot told you at the outset that we're headed for Hawaii now and this is going to be a good good flight. We'll have some turbulence along the way, but I can handle it. I'm doing OJT. This is on-the-job training, and this is a training session for me, but I've done pretty well in the training machine. You would get off that plane immediately if that was the case, but that's not how we look at companies. So I think we need director certification is one answer. How to achieve better board engagement with shareholders and investors, I think, is your question, which I'm not answering yet. And better engagement means dialogue. And I would love it if more investors would come to the company that I'm on the board of now. I can only handle one other board position at a time in addition to a full-time job at the training institute. But I'd love it if they come to me with what they think are the major material ESG risks that we face and have a discussion with us and force us to think more and deeply about them, because we are a high-tech company. It's a semiconductor test equipment company called Advantis that I'm on the board of. In any high-tech business, the world is changing very fast, and it will be a vastly different world in 20, 25 years. To keep up strategically with that technological change, but also with the environmental, ESG, et cetera, risks that it will bring on, and how the competition is going to respond to that and how we're going to respond. That requires a lot of really deep thinking. And if investors have some ideas about that, I'd love to hear about them. And it would be excellent. I mean, although I think our board is already quite engaged in ESG matters, but it'd be excellent spur, maybe some creative new ideas that we didn't think about, or some ways to do the risk modeling or the scenario analysis that would be helpful. But not many do. Almost nobody comes to us like that. I think there's a lot of box ticking going on. And at the end of the day, both companies and investors are groping their way through this ESG jungle that has suddenly arisen. And the fact of the matter is, we have to admit, it's a very difficult question. Again, it's a very difficult question because you don't really know until 20 years have passed, 25 years have passed, what factors are most materially going to affect your sustainability in many ways. We could say that carbon is, we could say climate change is, but with a lot of these other factors, we don't really know what the priority should be. And we won't know for 20 years. So this requires even deeper thinking than it might seem at the start. Better engagement with shareholders could come from the company, but then most companies don't want to reach out and have an open forum where they get sort of shot at by machine gun folks with extreme opinions. So it's not really going to come from the companies. It's going to come from shareholders, and it should. I don't think shareholders in the agency problem ridden value investment chain that we have, this investment chain ridden with agency problems, I don't think asset owners and many asset managers are involved enough, assiduous enough, and spending enough money at the problem, which will hit them in the face. But then they can say, well, oh, it was the company that did it. So everybody's blaming somebody else at the end of the day is the nature of the problem. And plus, so as a result, to finish things off, as Hella was saying, the sad fact about human character, humanity's character, is that we pay now, we pay later. But as was shown by famous psychologists, most human beings would far prefer to pay later, even if the amount would be much more. They're not particularly mathematically rational when it comes to this calculus. And that is likely to be our undoing.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, please. Yes, Helle.
I guess two things. One thing is when I say pay now, pay later, we can look at that as, you know, financials. But I do think most parents actually care so much about their children that they want them to have a better life than themselves. And I think if we turn it to that way and look at the externalities that you know, we, pointing at myself, right, I taking so granted right now and just using of these resources. So if we start looking at it in that way and saying, you know, can I look myself in the mirror and say, yeah, sorry, kiddo, I used this so that you will not have clean water in the future, or I use this so you can't see the elephant, or things like that. I think that's where we probably want to, you know, tap into the heart. So it's not only the brain, but actually also the heart of people. And then if I may, I mean, I think, Nicholas, you have the best opportunity in the world. You can be proactive. You can go on what some of these people that are over 100 in faculty in the Competent Boards program, many of them are saying, go on a governance roadshow. Go out there, talk to investors. The former chair of Shell now, Chad Holliday, was saying he were having lunch with young people from time to time in the company to understand, you know, do we go fast enough? Do we do the right things? So I think it's from a director point of view, it's also, can I be proactive? Do I feel comfortable enough? And then I'm fully aware the culture is different in different parts of the world. But I think many of the investors and you know, the Hermes, Federated Hermes, EOS, the ISS, all of those others also having that dialogue and having that engagement. And I think we're going from the time where it was, you know, the annual general meeting or the proxy season where it was, okay, here's where we're here to actually having an ongoing dialogue, ongoing engagement, which is much, you know, safer for the directors, as well as less costly for both the investors and the company and the society.
Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing those innovative ideas. Actually, you answered my next question. And my question was, what are the valuable tools and resources to help boards and corporate stakeholders? So you answered it. Thank you so much for that. And now we move to discussion section 3, which is about ESG performance and key competencies. And the question is, in your opinion, what are the critical components of good ESG performance and key competencies that are required from the board of directors? Now, I understand that, you know, it's very difficult. And as Benesh-san already mentioned, that it's the director certification that we need and not just ESG. But still, Helle, you have a full course on that. So please throw some light on what are the competencies that you look at.
I think that's excellent, by the way. I didn't mean to throw water on the concept. I just meant to expand it.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yes.
I'd like to increase my own competency.
Yes.
I will welcome you to join the ESG Competent Board Certificate and Designation Program, and you know, as I said, what I did was that I you know, worked with some of these global board members to say, what are the issues? What is it that they believe, that I believe, that needs to be something that's understood by the board of directors around the boardroom table. So one is, how do we handle all of these dilemmas, right? Think about it. Right now, it's, as Michael Tresco once, and the former chair of Unilever, said to me, things are coming 24/7 now. In old days, right, if you all remember when we actually were reading the newspaper and we had the phone, we didn't have the emails, right? Things were not as fast. Now you see something on the media, someone taking a picture, you need to react, right? So there's so much. So this dealing with the dilemmas, thinking the unthinkable, right? Another one of our faculty members, Nick Gowing, who was with BBC for many, many years, and he's very much like, how do we ensure that we train ourselves to think the unthinkable? Or ask the why, the chair of Maersk and Siemens, who is also part of the faculty, is like, how do we ensure that it's not an afterthought, but we actually embed it into it? But then into, yes, of course, the whole ESG area, the climate area, sustainable development goals. You showed the 17 sustainable development goals, the biggest pain points of the world. If we, as a board of directors, look at them and say, where are we part of the problem? Where are we part of the solution? You actually have part of your purpose. But also diversity, equity, and inclusion is a part of it. Human rights, supply chain issues, environmental issues in the supply chain, responsible use of data. Think about, we talked about AI before, all of this data that's all around us. How do we, as a company, as board of directors, guard that? Stewards, how are we ensuring that we take that data and use that in a responsible way? Cybersecurity, how do we ensure that even if we use it a responsible way, if it falls in the wrong hands, that it does not cause that harm? But also corruption, anti-corruption, integrity, and what is the tax investment and pay? We had the big G7 meeting in terms of, should we have a minimum tax of 15%? What does that mean? Pay, how much are we actually, the pay gap between the different, and when we invest, do we really invest for the future? Incentives, what are the incentives that we need to have in place? And of course, think about what is the stakeholder and shareholder engagement that we just talked about. How do we do that in the most efficient way and ensure that we actually not just put a statement out there and wait for a reaction, but have that ongoing engagement, ongoing dialogue? And then we end up with what is the future of good corporate governance? What does that look like? And Mervyn King out of South Africa and bear the name The King. So the King report out of South Africa, the Nelson Mandela asked him to start, is part of it as well. So we're trying to give all of these different aspects and do it in a way where we really integrate it into the thinking and not seeing as the 12 different topics, but actually how does all of these play together? And then of course, in terms of the climate, much more in depth. But I think and sorry, I think I got carried away in all this. I think what you might actually have wanted was in terms of a report we put out on the future boardroom competences, and where and I'll do that short and I can share the report. Sorry about that. But we basically said, what are the future boardroom competences? And we asked global leaders, and we got all of these fantastic answers, and we started to think, okay, should we say 86% think that integrity? No, that doesn't make sense. So instead, what we did was we actually put these word clouds together, and we put it into 4 different word clouds. One was, how does stewardship in the 21st century look like? The other one was, what are the brain? What are those competences you need to have? But also, what are the personal traits? What's the heart? And then the hand in terms of like, how do you actually act upon these? So sorry for going long on the other things, but I'll share that report. I think that was actually what you wanted me to ask or to talk about.
That would be wonderful. That would
Okay.
be wonderful. Actually, while you were talking all this, one question was brewing in my mind, and that's a very negative question. In fact, I have seen a lot of companies actually for the sustainability, when it comes to reporting, they think that it's a formality and they have to get the reports out there, and they use some consulting firms, pay to them and get it done. So where does the board involvement come in that sense, right? So yeah, any views on that?
Yeah, and I think it's very important that the board of directors are involved, not only at the end to read it and say nice pictures. That's too late. I think we need to have, and goes to integrated reporting. We need to really upfront, who are our key stakeholders? Let's agree, what are our key stakeholders? We want to do good for everyone. But everything you need to balance the resources, right? So who's the key stakeholders? And then what are the key material issues, and look at it both from a materiality and double or dual materiality, and all of these dynamic materialities, all of the different things. And then of course it's not the board to do the report, but I would say the board didn't want to see it in between. They want to actually sign off in the same way they do with the financials. They want to make sure that they actually have their part of what are their oversights in there. And then of course at the end really sign off and perhaps even ask the auditors or what can we do better? Are we and in my mind also ensure that there is the link between, if it's a sustainability report, a link between that report and the financial report. All too often I've seen one report like employees are our most important assets or something like that, nice words. And then the other reports show something that's totally different. So let's make sure we actually have that integration, if it's in one report or if it's just by integrated thinking in the boardroom.
Waiting for IFRS to come up statements.
Nisha, if I could,
Please finish, son.
I'd love to
add to it.
sort of add to or just extend something that Helle was saying. How to achieve better, I think what you really mean when you say better, you mean efficient, more effective engagement with shareholders, leading to better results.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that's very important is that asset managers have to start to realize if they really believe all this stuff and want it to work, they're going to have to coordinate and talk to each other a lot more. And collective engagement is far more efficient and effective than engaging one-on-one and pretending in front of your asset owners that you have a secret sauce in terms of how you talk to companies and the way you dialogue with them. I think this is nonsense. It's much more efficient to collectively engage on the issues that we can all agree upon, which there are many. Secondly, we have a plethora of data. It's not most of it machine analyzable because people hire consulting firms that put it all in encrypted PDFs that my algorithms cannot read. This is almost as if it's done on purpose so that I cannot collect the data and compare companies on a standardized basis. We also have a plethora of standardized criteria that the companies follow or the consultants follow by lockstep. And yeah, if that was all material, which a lot of it is, but if it was all machine readable, you could much more easily come up with a rough cut first analysis of companies and how they compare with each other, but it's not machine readable. So somebody's got to sit there in India or Africa or someplace, or southern US, hand inputting data. This is a ridiculous state of affairs to be in a world where in 40 years we could be out of air to breathe and 3 degrees centigrade higher. So I guess those are the kind of things that I get really concerned about, are these systemic framework type issues that we have all this discussion about ESG, and it's all very well intended, but we're not diving into the core framework legal structural issues. Does it make sense to have anonymous custody accounts? Does it make sense to have complete anonymity of share ownership and very difficult to analyze voting statistics? Does that really contribute to accountability in ESG or in financial results as well? No, it does not. And most of all, one of the biggest problems we have is we have totally upside down incentives. We have managed in the last 30, 40 years to allow largely greedy American, I have to say, executives to lead us down this road where, changing the profits of the company, supposedly impacting positively profitability of a company in a 2 or 3 year time framework, is deserving of millions of dollars, ridiculous amounts of money, when that could just be nothing other than pure luck because your predecessor set the company up right. We need to change the incentive structure of executives to be much, much more long-term. And when I say long-term, I mean 10 years or so, not 3, not 5, 10. Something that really puts the onus on, gee, if I don't get this right, and remember the stock market 10 years from now, when those shares finally vest, if 50% of my income over the last so many years has, 10 years, has come from that stock, but it hasn't vested yet, and the stock market's reading forward from the 10-year point, that means it's reading forward 20 years ahead as to whether I'm truly a sustainable and growing company 20 years from now at the 10-year point. If you follow my slightly confusing description. That would be the kind of thing that would change incentives in the boardroom. And we don't have that. We have the exact opposite. It's CEOs can talk the right line, but they're not paid on the right line.
Yeah. So do you suggest that we should have incentives for the board of directors or even the executive directors, which are ESG metrics linked? What's your opinion on that?
Well, we have some companies. The company I'm on the board of has just instituted a part of the the executive compensation framework is ESG linked. Mm-hmm. That's subject to the whims of the S&P index, of course, and how they view us in comparison with a very small number of rivals in the world. So I don't know how dependable that is, but it does signal to investors that we're trying to do the right thing. But it is not a huge portion of compensation. And I'm not sure I trust the ESG, relative comparison quality of various indices in the first place, to be frank. So I think at the end of the day in this discussion, the 80-20 rule, right? 80 to 90% of the beneficial impact we could have from incentives with the present structure, we can talk about other structures later on, is simply by making executive compensation less cash, more stock, and very long vesting rules for the stock. And people who are willing to work for that must, in order to receive that and be happy with that compensation, believe in the sustainability framework that they've set up under a lot of discussion, hard discussion, scenario analysis, not just following the standard SASB or whatever it is standards, but thinking hard about how our company and our industry is going to be affected over the next 15, 20 years and coming up with maybe some of their own standards. That's the kind of people it's going to attract and keep and incent. What we do now is the opposite. We attract, keep, and incent the folks who, largely are allowed to think on 2 or 3 year time frames.
Thank you so much. Helle, would you like to add on to that? Yeah, I mean, this is a huge debate, right? So we have Willis Todd Watson, part of the faculty to discuss it, and I have directors that says, why should I incentivize for doing the right thing? It's just out if you don't, right? I have other directors that say, okay, first time there's something you do that is not in line with our code of conduct, with our values, with the right thing to do. Okay, that's a mistake. We train you. da 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 da. The second time you get the warning, third time you're out, right? And often, and the same goes when we talk about, corruption and etc. We need to look at those things that's almost too good to be true, and say, oh, okay, is this too good to be true? Is this because we sold more, but we did not do it in the right way, or is this correct? And the same goes in terms of the incentives plan. How do we put that incentive plan together? And I totally agree. We need to think about what is the long-term way for directors, but also the C-suite. And if we look at it, the years that a CEO is sitting in that seat nowadays is just plummeting, right? So that puts even more on the board of directors, because the board of directors are the ones that actually sitting there for a few more years. You can argue some of them too many years, but nevertheless more years, and have that fiduciary duty, right, for the long term. So how do you put that in place? If you give shares, that's not vesting over X number of years, well, are you then ending up in exactly the same situation? It's like, okay, let's maximize until, I really don't want to think about that. That's the way it's done. But let's be honest that we have different types of people and different ways of being incentivized.
Yeah,
right? And I think we need to get that right. And FCLT, which is another organization, is doing fantastic work in that as well.
Thank you so much. And I agree, because incentivization was actually a part of, from the theoretical side, from agency theory, where it was needed in the US, as Banish-san mentioned, for the greedy Americans, that's the word he used. And then now we are talking about stewardship theory and stakeholders. So why do we need incentives for that, right? We are stewards all for that. And it's our earth. There's no planet B. We all have to take care, right? Thank you so much. My next question to Hele is about disclosures. So directors are facing, and even the companies are facing demands for the disclosures. And Banish-san just mentioned about the data issues that we are getting. And the data is not in the soft format. It's all available in hard copy, and then not comparable and benchmarked. It's difficult. And even WEF has mentioned about that there are inconsistencies. The frameworks are different in different countries and different companies. And how do we make sure? So what's the pressure, does that pressure come to the board, and how are they handling it? And what are you teaching in your program about that?
Yeah, so you have a few different buckets here. One thing is that what are we reporting, using what kind of standards? The thing is, can we trust that data? And the last, well, perhaps not even trust, that's the auditing. And also, are they readable? Right, we are living in where we digitalization, we could in reality put small tax on the data, and therefore if we can trust the data, I can get the data in whatever form, can get the data in whatever form. That's XBRL for those that think financials, where we have that. But let's just go to the demand and what it is that's happening in the boardroom at the moment. So of course we have many of these standards that you're saying. Many have heard about the global reporting initiatives. Many have heard about SASB. That's now merged with integrated reporting. So it's now called Value Reporting Foundations. We have the CDP, where many companies are reporting their carbon disclosure data, but also water and other things. So you have the CDSB that is in terms of the climate as well. So that's kind of like, think about that as one. TCFD, so the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, I always get that one wrong. That Mark Carney, when he was the governor of Bank of England in terms of Financial Stability Board, set up together with Michael Bloomberg, that goes in and look at climate-related financial disclosures. So what is it that companies should report in that? We're talking about scenario planning, etc. That is now getting New Zealand was the first to say this is mandatory. You have the UK. You now have, I mean, the countries are piling up now. Switzerland was the last one, I think, yesterday that makes that
mandatory,
mandatory, right? So that's clearly, you know, if you haven't looked at the TCFD report, or do it now, right? And start to ask management, do we have the scenarios? What are we doing in this regard? Do we have a shadow price on carbon? What would the world look like? And what would our balance sheet and our PL look like, income statement look like, if suddenly, you know, the price on carbon was this, right? And I think that would give the audit committee and the whole board something. So the other thing is that from the traditional financial, and I should say 30 years ago, I wrote my thesis when I was studying to become an accountant about we needed to embed externalities into this traditional financial reporting. And my good advisor at the university said that will never happen. That is not true. It is happening. So at the moment, we have what's called IFRS, so International Financial Standards. Oh God. Yeah. Going in, those are, you know, they also have the accounting standards. I should stop with all the acronyms. And 140 countries that basically using these. The auditors are using them too. They are now starting to say, okay, we should have a standard board for sustainability. So that is happening. I was going to say as we speak, and it's probably going to be announced during this COP26, which is the big global climate meeting that's happening in Glasgow in
November.
Yes. So we are seeing a lot in that respect. There is, and then I'll stop there. There is this. That they actually starting now to work on all of both these traditional financials and I was going to say non-financial, but the GRI, the SASP, etc. The prototype on how that will look like. And I would strongly recommend that, you know, board of directors ask again management to say, have we looked at that? What would that mean to us? I bet that many organizations already have it, but I don't think that board of directors have had it presented to them and understand the impact that that will have on the company. And when auditors are starting to ask, you know, what about this? And should we, you know, in terms of impairment test, you know, what is the value of these different assets? What impact will that have? So a lot of activities in that area, and you know, giving my 30-year master thesis, I'm quite excited in terms of seeing what's happening at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing with us that. My next question to Nicholas Benissan, and you can add to what Helle said to your answer. You earlier talked about the transparency of the individual stock holding and how could tracking beneficial ownership help in improving governance and sustainability. So I would like to know more about that, and how will that increase the transparency of?
Well, I came up with this sort of embarrassingly, some would say, crazy idea. But to me, it's very logical, because it's my idea, I suppose, that, you know, we have a corporate legal structure, a corporate law framework that was designed over several hundred years and largely gelled in place about 120 years ago at the 1890s or so in the United States, that gives away free limited liability, you know, for basically pennies or dollars of registration costs to anybody who wants to get it. And so Mr. Trump or anyone else can set up all sorts of companies, or, you know, the opioid family, right, can set up all sorts of pharmaceutical companies and sell opioids and make billions of dollars for many years, and then go bankrupt, and not only get a settlement decree, but protect its own self, so family interests, from further possible litigation under the law. So we have this system that was created to power the Industrial Revolution when the onus needed to be put on the ability to raise large amounts of capital for making railroads and iron plants, this kind of stuff. And the externalized risk that was generated by these corporations wasn't so much, wasn't a big problem yet, compared to the positive upside advantages in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s of corporate expansion. And we're now in a world 100 years later where the size of corporations is massive. And they now account for 90% plus of the world's economy, not 20% of the world's economy. Therefore, they are controlling our future result in terms of climate, et cetera. And we have the same structure, however, of incentives of, hey, you can set up a company and it can externalize risk with asbestos or tobacco or radioactivity or thalidomide or credit derivatives out the wazoo and tank the world economy or the Gulf of Mexico by blowing up an oil rig. And when it goes bankrupt, all that externalized risk, which exceeds its assets, gets shoved off onto society. And that's basically what we're talking about with the climate change problem. Massive externalized risk that nobody wants to take responsibility for because of the tragedy of the commons. And so how do you deal with that? Well, the way you deal with that is it doesn't make sense to allow a shareholder to get rid of future risk that he may have because he's been voting for the wrong board for the last 10 years, contributed to by simply selling shares. You say to him, we're going to have this share and it's going to be a blockchain stock. And it's going to track every single owner, everybody who ever owned it. We will, ingrained into the blockchain will be his name and how long he owned it and who he sold it to, et cetera, et cetera. And so what's going to happen is when you buy the stock, you all put 20 basis points of price into a fund, which is secured in trust and invested in treasury bills. And when you sell the stock, for the next 5 years after that, the money will stay in that trust fund. And you'll get back all your money if the company doesn't go bankrupt in the meantime. But if the company does go bankrupt due to externalized risk and asbestos litigation and whatnot, opioid litigation, et cetera, in the meantime, then you will give up a portion of the 20 basis points that you put into the fund originally in proportion to the length of time that you've owned the stock. If you only owned it for 3 years, it'll be less than if you owned it for 5 years. On the other hand, to prevent people from gaming the system, we're going to assume you owned it for at least 1 year. So high-speed traders are going to be assumed to own it for at least 1 year. And that means that everyone's going to be thinking, and the stock will be traded on the basis of thinking, how close to bankruptcy might this company be given future regulatory risk that will come from all these things that we're talking about. And it'll come, there'll be a carbon tax, there'll be a tax on other things, there'll be other rules, and it will cause certain companies to go out of business and go bankrupt. Now, that's an extreme. You may say, well, that's bankruptcy. That's only 5% or 3% of cases, but it's the chance that it will go bankrupt that incentives people. If you pay then executives with subordinated stock based on that same blockchain stock, you're putting them under a leveraged risk situation where they have to be even more insensitive to the vagaries of the stock, which will now reflect its future sustainability much, much, much more than it did in the past, because people won't get back their 20 basis points. And that's a large part of the market because remember, there's been a lot of trading of the stock in the last 5 years. So I came up with this crazy structure and put it on the Harvard Law blog. And I'll stop there. I'm not trying to convince the world about this. I'm just saying to people, we are at a stage in life of civilization when we have to rethink a corporate law that was created 120 years ago and doesn't serve our long-term purposes anymore.
Thank you so much.
I'm open to new ideas, other ideas.
Thank you so much, Mr. Banish-san. I would request you to post the link to the audience for the.
Okay, I think I did really well. I'll do it again, no problem.
And yeah, I would like to tell the audience that there is a podcast where he has explained this concept of, shareholding in a blockchain, and you can listen to that one. I have a question, but given the time constraint, I will ask him personally. My question was related to ETFs and the passive investment strategies, and how does that affect this blockchain thing? So I will take it later with him. Thank you so much. Let's take the questions from the audience now. We have a question here on how difficult is it for such experienced and enlightened board members to realize that there would be none of this without the E and S? Aren't they being harming their and everyone's interest by all these competence-based eyewash or greenwash, or all this, especially when for years all leading organizations and reports have been shouting hoarse about these global risks? So, yeah, Harry.
Yeah, I'm just trying to read. So how difficult is it for such experienced enlightened board members to realize there would be none of well, it's a good question, right? Because if you think about it, you have fantastic, knowledgeable people that are, getting up the rig, that are been used to work in the way that were very hierarchical, and this is the way we do it. And things are changing, right? Things are changing very, very, very fast. And often, and as we are as people, it's good enough to say, well, I should go to the gym. Well, I guess now we have a problem in terms of COVID times, but nevertheless, so you buy the membership, but you not necessarily do it. So I think we are seeing now that the incentives, the incentives to actually get this insight is coming as much more the stick than perhaps the carrot, because I've been saying in terms of the carrot, you get so much more if you understand these different areas. You're leaving money on the table by not understanding these areas. But now when you have some of the great large asset managers and also the small asset managers that are able to oust board of directors from the world's largest companies, that open the eyes for others. So I think we are at the tipping point in terms of that, and clearly I'm seeing the interest in the both ESG training, but also the climate training, and so I think it's hard for all of us to understand something that's not new, or that's new or newer. But we are slowly seeing that changing, and I'm hoping, of course, that I believe we need more young people that also get into the boardrooms and are have the courage to actually ask some of the questions as well, for the benefit of the corporation.
Nisha, if I could comment?
Yes, please.
I don't know if it's a different perspective or not, and you can call me simple-minded, but I think this is pretty obvious why it's possible for such experienced and enlightened board members to sort of be oblivious. They're not incented to be anything other than oblivious. They grew up in a world where they were oblivious and paid to be oblivious, because a company makes more money by externalizing risk. The more money the more risk you can externalize and shove off into someone else's lap or the public, the more profit you can take. Management is called managing. I realized this at age 35 or so, because you manage to get by. You don't get by optimally. You manage to get by. You balance various things. And so you're always operating at the margin. And the society's rules and regulations right now permit you to get by with E&S that are completely substandard given where we have to be. And so they're not required to do anything more than what they're doing now, and they don't, nor are they incented to do that much more. In fact, they're incented to do less if they possibly could, because they would externalize more risk and make more money. So until you change these very, very, very basic factors or elements that influence management and board members. Now you may say, well, the board members are there to control management. Well, but they grew up in the same milieu. They were CEO, 2 years ago. And then they're looking at the employment market and saying, well, even if they thought that with high integrity, we should get rid of the CEO, he's not looking long-term enough. We need to get down to ESG issues more, et cetera, he'll do something to satisfy them, but he'll satisfy them while also trying to, under president incentive, maximize short-term and medium-term profit. So he'll satisfy us away just the minimum he has to do to get through that tunnel. And they, on the other hand, will be looking at him saying, well, if we have to fire him, even if we were very high integrity and we think, well, he's not doing well enough, let's fire him. The market for CEOs is such that we have to really suffer potential high shareholder risk for disrupting the company to look for a CEO who was willing to do what we're willing to do, what we're asking him to do, possibly for less money incented on a 10-year stock timeframe that this crazy guy Banish is talking about. So you see, when you talk about replacing CEOs because they're not doing enough of this, it's not so easy when you're actually on a board.
Agree. Yes. And then, with the CEOs itself. So you rightly said that they both have to manage it. And as Heli mentioned right in the beginning, that there has to be long-term objective, right? So long-term objective and long-term planning has to be there. It's not just be project-based mentality, right? Last question I'll take from the audience. And this is about how can we measure how ESG competent boards are? And is there any methodology where you measure the competencies for them?
I think you can, do you mind? Is it all right? Yeah, I think what you can do, it's very difficult to do in Japan because we don't have that custom yet, although I'm trying to instill it. But as an asset manager, interview management, but also the outside board members, the lead independent director or anybody you can get your hands on, and try to get a feel to the extent that he can say so without divulging, confidential information and discussions about, how much discussion about these issues is taking place at the board level, how much, serious, scenario, what happens if this, what happens if that happens, how does that, as I said, Heli said earlier, how is this going to affect our financials in 10 or 15 years, how much impact could it have, et cetera. And get, answer those, try to get those questions answered, but also try to figure out whether they're not just following the SASB criteria or the SS criteria and hiring consultants, but they're actually thinking internally hard and deeply and talking about at the board level, what are those issues that will affect profitability. I mean, this is not just a do-gooder thing we're doing. We're talking about things which, actions which fit with our strategy and will enable us to keep making profit 10 or 15 years from now, as opposed to sliding down the tubes. And so an outside director ought to be able to answer questions like that. What are you actually doing and what kind of issues and risks and scenario planning come up? And not just say, we look at the S&P listed criteria, try to follow it.
Yeah. Heli, please add to that.
Yes, and I agree in terms of board assessments, and most board of directors are having a board assessment done, and I'm doing some of them, but I embed that in that. The other thing I might be able to say is that I actually just put in the manuscript to a book where board of directors can use that also to measure how competent or how much they know about these different areas. It's called Stewards of the Future, a guide for competent boards. So it's not out yet, but I'll make sure I'll let you know when it's out there. But basically, give board of directors and others, of course, an ability to say, okay, how are we doing on these different areas that's within the wider ESG frame.
Oh, could I ask Helle a question? Do you mind?
Yeah, please.
Why isn't Larry Fink, given the power that they have, say, this is one example, or Vanguard, or any of those large, asking for very long-term incentives of the same type that I proposed, and pushing for fully machine readable disclosure of key elements, the SASB, they're working towards XBRL there, but we could do a lot more than just XBRL when it comes to machine readability. And they know that. Why aren't they pushing for that?
I mean, if I knew, but I think I don't know. Let's start there. I don't know if they do it. I do know that they are, them and Federated Hermes and all of the others out there having the engagement with the companies and thinking some of these long-term. I know that they are using now their power of investment, not so much the power of procurement, well, power of procurement of money, in terms of being very clear on how they will expect that the companies and the board of directors will get the insight and able to actually move the needle on sustainability. In terms of the
fact that part of the reason is that they also seek at the same time to manage pension funds of the same corporations.
I mean, the pension funds, if you think about the pension funds, right? And I had another pension fund that I was interviewing that also contribute to the climate program the other day. And you're saying, well, look at all of these things at the moment. It's a catalog of investments. But the other thing is that if you have a person that gets into a pension fund today, think about how many years you need to be able to guarantee that person. You pay in the next 40, 50 years, let's say you're 20, who knows at that time when we, but then nowadays, especially for the women, live even longer, right? So you need to have enough for all of that. So the pension funds and such, they need to do the long-term investment.
No, that's right. I didn't express myself clearly enough. What I meant to ask was BlackRock doesn't just manage passive funds, they also want to manage a lot of corporate pension funds. Could that be the reason why the large passive funds are not as proactive as they could be?
I don't know. I'm not part of any of these, so I haven't asked that question to anyone. But what I do know is that you can say from a lot of corporations that's now starting to say, well, get the investors that we deserve, and if it's the day trader versus those that are on the longer term. So I think, I mean, we can say, okay, they need to do this, they need to do this, the government needs to do different things. I think from a corporation part of view, that's where you have control, and that's where you can start. And you can say, if you're the one that starts going out to the large asset managers and say, this is how we are doing it, because we believe that that's the way we are guarding your future investment, then I think you have an opportunity for them then to say, that's a smart model. Now we go to your competitor and asking them, what are you going to do to guard our future income? And by that, you have a much more proactive way of reacting. So that how much I can help at the moment, we could ask them.
Well, I'm asking rhetorical questions, having heard from multiple people who have worked in institutions like that in the past, that this is one of the major reasons why certain companies, certain asset managers, are not nearly as proactive as they might be. It is a clear conflict of interest when you are a passive fund, a lots of ETFs and this kind of stuff. And you also want to manage pension money from the same corporations whose stocks you own across the broad index. That is going to skew your incentives as to how strongly you talk to them and whether you submit shareholder proposals or vote for shareholder proposals.
But in that sense, if I were the board of directors of that corporation that have my own pension fund, right, in-house, I would make sure that I ask the questions to ensure that the people working for me will actually have their pension, in the long run. And you can argue, and very, very smart person that unfortunately is no longer with us many, many years ago said, I don't want to have people in my corporation that have all of their income, all of their pension, all of their retirement funds invested in shares from this company, because if the worst can happen, this company is no longer. That means that they not only lose their job and their income, they also lose their retirement funds. So I think we need to think a little bit bigger in that regard and say, what is it from also a board of director point of view? What are the questions to ask?
Yeah, that's a different issue, though. That's a different issue from how passive funds are conflicted with respect to the fact they also want to manage pension money of the same corpus they invest in. It's an issue. You're absolutely right. And we should be concerned about it as a board, and I always am, but it's a different issue, that's all.
Yeah.
I think you and I, we need to have a different, another conversation.
No, we need more of this, Nisha. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
It's been
much.
great.
Yes, so that was exactly, and I'm also wanting to speak, but then we are running out of time. Yeah, that was exactly Tom's issue as well, that how do we yeah, returns and pension fund, all these are important stuff. So we'll yes, of course we will discuss it some other time. Thank you very much to Nicholas Banerjee-San, Helly Bank Jorgensen, and the attendees for a wonderful session today. Thank you for attending. And if you have any questions and if you want any links or any more information, please do contact us on our email ID, which you received from Zoom. And looking forward to seeing you on the next session. Have a good night and good day from wherever you are joining. And thank you so very much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Very well hosted. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great to meet you, Helen. Thank you.
Thanks, and likewise, we'll be in touch.
Let's be in touch. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Bye.
Toronto, Tokyo, Singapore.
Yeah.
Yes.